I'm an interviewer at the Public Library of Cincinnati in Hamilton County. I'm interviewing John Dolibois on November 22nd, 2006 at the main library. Our camera operator today is Yvonne Franklin. So might as well begin. And Dolibois, you're from Luxembourg, as I understand.
Yes, I was born in Luxembourg. Became an immigrant, legal immigrant, at the age of 13. My father and I came over together.
So what was it like growing up in Luxembourg in the 20s?
Well, Luxembourg is a pretty small country, 999 square miles, population of about 200,000 back then, and completely surrounded by Belgium, France, Germany, so it's right in the heart of Europe. And they call it the green heart of Europe because it's originally Luxembourg was pretty much an agricultural country, but now one of in fact, the largest steel company in the world is in Luxembourg. The second largest employer is Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. Third largest is DuPont and Amur. So the American industry has moved into Luxembourg.
So what was it like?
It has become more of an industrial country.
What was it like growing up there as a child?
Well, I think for myself, it was rather an interesting boyhood. Luxembourg is a beautiful little country. In fact, it's often referred to as the Switzerland of the North. It goes back to the 10th century, 963 AD. And you've heard of Siegfried, the Wagnerian opera. He's actually the founder of Luxembourg. Count Siegfried of the Ardennes bought a hunk of property in what is now Luxembourg and built a castle on a high rock promontory. And it's called, in Celtic, Luxembourg, which eventually became Little Burg, Luxembourg. And that was 963 AD. St. Patrick and a compatriot, St. Willibrord, founded an abbey in a little town called Echternach, and that was in 698. And that abbey is still functioning too. The northern part of Luxembourg is the Ardennes, where the Battle of the Bulge took place. And of course, if you like hiking and outdoors, that's a beautiful place to be on hilly. Lots of rivers, the Moselle River being the most famous, which is the border between Germany and Luxembourg. And then the other rivers, which create a lot of valleys among those mountains. So as a boy, you can have a lot of fun there. The hills, the parks.
Memories then?
Yeah, there are 74 castles in Luxembourg. You can imagine all those different cantons. So the castle ruins, youth hostels, and very romantic.
The low ones have been called the cockpit of Europe, and Luxembourg has a ringside seat.
Right.
So what was the political standing of?
Well, it's a Grand Duchy.
Right.
Luxembourg's a Grand Duchy.
The alliances, as you had these opposing Germany and France.
Oh yeah, the Benelux. Right now, Benelux, Holland and Belgium.
In the 20s, what were the political leanings of Luxembourg?
Well, it's a constitutional monarchy, and the ruling monarch is a Grand Duke. Grand Duke, at that particular time, was Grand Duchess Charlotte when I was a boy, and then her son, Grand Duke John, took over 1964 when she abdicated, and now his son, Grand Duke Henry, is the Grand Duke of Luxembourg.
But would the people lean towards French support back then, or German, or neutral? Or?
If you ask that of a Luxembourger, he'd say Luxembourg. But it's trilingual, actually. Everybody in Luxembourg can speak French, German, and Luxembourgish. But if you're close to the southern part, which is France, you'll find that most of the street names and the villages and all are French. If you're on the German side, then more German is spoken, and the street signs, everything's in German. So it all depends.
So, and you ended up coming to Akron, Ohio.
Akron, Ohio.
Must have had something to do with the Goodyear Rubber Company then.
Well, not really. It's the other way around, actually. The Goodyear Rubber Company came to Luxembourg after I was here.
After?
Yeah. But, and there's a connection there with Miami University because the vice president of Goodyear at that particular time was a member of the Board of Trustees of Miami University, with which I became affiliated. So it was I think it was 1958 that Goodyear came to Luxembourg, and I got somewhat involved in that because of the Miami connection.
So what brought you to Akron?
Well, that's a rather romantic story. I'm the youngest of 8 children, and I was born in 1918, 2 weeks after the armistice was signed. The oldest of the 8 children was my sister Marie, who was 18 years old at the time. She fell in love with an American during the occupation. The American forces liberated Luxembourg in World War I. It had been occupied by the Germans for 4 years. So the American troops were billeted in Luxembourg, and we had some Americans billeted in our own home. And my sister fell in love with one of the Americans. And they were going to get married, and the war was over and all of that. Then I was born, and my mother died 2 weeks later of the Spanish flu. So their romance had to be postponed, and the American came back alone to Akron. But they corresponded for 10 years. And he came back in 1929 and married her, and brought her to Akron. Meanwhile, my other brothers and sisters who were older than I all got married, and all taken care of. My father and I were alone, so we decided to come to Akron and be with my sister, who had really raised me after my mother died. So that's how I got to Akron.
Okay. And what did your father do in Akron?
He was retired, actually. He was in his late 50s, going on to 60. But he was a contractor, general contractor, building. And all my brothers got into the business. So he was a successful builder in Luxembourg.
Did I read that you had some social stigma in Akron to overcome, or?
Well, I think the biggest problem was that I was 13 years old, but I couldn't speak English. So they put me in kindergarten. 13 years old in kindergarten. I learned the English language from the bottom up. But after 3 months in kindergarten, I was promoted to the 3rd grade, and then eventually ended up in the 6th grade. But English has been my best subject ever since. So I'm grateful to the teachers at the elementary school in Akron. So starting me at the bottom and teaching me.
And you were already fluent in French, German, and
oh yeah,
and
French and German. Yeah, I went to school in Luxembourg for 6 years. And when you start school in Luxembourg, you start out in German. You're reading, writing, and arithmetic. And by the 3rd grade, you go into French. Then your instruction is half day of French, half day of German.
So your home language when you were a child would have been?
Luxembourgish.
Yeah.
Okay. And Luxembourgish is basically German, but Germans don't understand. So they outlawed the Luxembourgish when they occupied Luxembourg. All the street names had to be renamed.
So there probably wasn't a lot of affection for Germany if you were occupied.
None at all. The Nazis really took over. All the streets were renamed. Adolf Hitler Boulevard, and Hermann Goering Avenue, and all that stuff. And of course, you had to speak German, but you weren't allowed to speak Luxembourgish. But the home language would be Luxembourgish. Actually, my family goes back to the Saar Basin, which has been French, and it's German, and it's independent, so it depends on what status the government had when you were born. So you're over there, you're either a citizen of the Tsar when it was independent, or French, or German.
So as a child, you come to the United States at age 13. What were the biggest things, biggest differences, surprises?
Well, for one thing, economically, it was in the depth of the Depression.
Right. 31.
So that was a hard part. But fortunately, my sister and her husband and the family took pretty good care of us. But I learned to take care of myself too, because when I decided to go to high school, I got involved with the Boy Scouts. I I think the Americanization of myself is pretty much through the Boy Scouts. And I'm going to summer camp, beautiful camp in Akron. Actually, it's a peninsula, Ohio, Camp Manitowoc. And I spent more time there than I did at home. So, and I think I learned more about the United States and the Boy Scouts than anywhere else. So I became rather dedicated to scouting.
And then you went on
An
to
Eagle Scout.
Went on to Miami, Eagle Scout. There weren't that many of them,
So
were there?
No, we're still in a rare
Quite
category.
an honor.
But I've kept up my activity in scouting ever since. In fact, I was going to be into professional scouting as a career until the war kind of, World War II kind of changed.
You were in Miami, and did you make it through 4 years?
Oh yeah, we were very lucky.
You weren't cut off, but they didn't send you early to the war.
Yeah, my wife and I graduated together in 1942. And then I got 6 months at Procter & Gamble, P&G. And then the draft board got me. I was ready by then. So I went in the Army in 1942.
I understand they wanted to totally disregard your ability in language and put you on a tractor or driver?
No, actually I became a tank driver.
Tank driver.
They needed tank drivers the day I was inducted at Fort Thomas. We lived in Cincinnati then when I worked at P&G in Ivydale. But, so then I know when I was inducted, they wanted to know what I could do. And I told them I was born in Luxembourg, I could speak French and German, and I'd like to get into military intelligence. And the guy said, "Did you ever drive a truck?" I said, "No." How about a bus or a tractor or a plow? And I said, "No, but I can speak German fluently." But I ended up at Fort Thomas, Kentucky as a tank driver. If I'd have been inducted a day later, I would have been Cooks and Baker School in Texas somewhere. But I enjoyed the Armored Force, Fort Knox. Got to drive every armored vehicle, fire every weapon, and that was kind of fun. Enjoyed that.
And finally it occurred to somebody that your talents lay elsewhere.
Yeah, well that wasn't until 18 months later. I graduated from OCS, got my commission, and actually got my commission from General Patton himself. He was a commencement speaker when I graduated from OCS. And because I got my commission in mechanized cavalry, and he was a cavalryman, so he pinned the cross sabers on the 10 of us in the class who were cavalry officers.
What kind of reputation did he have at the time?
Well, he was a famous pattern, and he was the commander of the 8th Armored Corps, which was stationed at Fort Knox. That was the coincidental connection. But I went to Chaffee, Arkansas, and became a cavalry officer for the 16th Armored Division, which had just been formed. But a few months later, they found out I could speak German. Somebody stuck a hole in the right card, and the card dropped out. And boy, I moved fast from there, and then they transferred me to intelligence, so 3 hours notice. Came into Washington, and then found out where I was going to be at Camp Ritchie, Maryland, which was a secret training center for interrogation.
And how long a training did you have?
Well, excuse me. Actually, it's kind of funny. I don't think that our War Department realized that it was important to have trained interrogators until we were ready to invade North Africa. And then it occurred to somebody in Washington that we're going to come in contact with the enemy, and somebody's going to have to interrogate them, so we need all German-speaking officers. So a blanket order went out all over the country. And if you were a pilot, or you were even a doctor, or no matter what your background was, if you could speak German, you were transferred. And in my case, a tank officer. But the training course for my particular section in military intelligence is called IPW, Interrogator Prisoners of War. And that was a 2-month course. At the end of the 2 months, you were slated to go overseas for an interrogation team, 2 officers, 3 enlisted men. And that would be an interrogation team assigned to a regiment or a battalion or army post or headquarters. And any prisoners taken by that unit, your team would do the interrogating. And that was called the tactical interrogation. On the battlefront, you take prisoners on the battlefront, and you do the tactical interrogation, which is what is your unit, what kind of weapons do you have, who's your commanding officer, etc. Well, I was alerted when my 2 months were up, and got packed, said goodbye to my wife, and went to the post. We would be shipped out, and I was disalerted, along with 2 other colleagues. And they decided that with our background in armored force, we could be better teachers. So we ended up being instructors in Camp Ritchie, training others to be interrogators. With the result that I stayed on at Ritchie for 10 more months as a teacher. And as a teacher, you learn a lot more than you do as a student. So the result was that I went into what they call strategic interrogation. When I went overseas then, we interrogated only general officers, scientists, people who had personal contact with Himmler, Hitler, Goebbels. And so when such prisoners were found in a PW camp, they were transferred to our unit, which was in the Ardennes, not far from Luxembourg, in a hunting lodge. And that's where we interrogated high-ranking Nazis, important Nazis, guys working on the V1, V2, chemical bacteria warfare.
So, looking back at it from today's standards, was interrogation in its infancy back then? Was interrogation pretty primitive back then, or were they pretty sophisticated?
Well, I would say primitive. And by that I mean, we really didn't have much intelligence about the Germans. Because during the 30s, when the Nazis came to power, there wasn't much, there weren't many refugees coming. I mean, there were refugees, but not enough Germans. Most of those were Jewish refugees. And you couldn't have your whole intelligence unit made up of Jewish refugees. So we really didn't get much information about the Germans. And of course, the Nazi organization was very secretive. We didn't even know what some of these titles were, the ranks that they held. Of course, in retrospect, looking back, hindsight, if we hadn't studied Mein Kampf, we'd have known exactly what Hitler was up to. But as usual, we don't do that kind of stuff. We always wait until there's a crisis and then we plunge in. But we're not very good at deterrence.
So how much success did you have in extracting information?
Oh, we had no problem with that.
So you had soldiers who wanted to...
Our biggest job was knowing how to ask intelligent questions, because we didn't have much of a background. So our biggest function was finding out who was who did what, who was responsible for this or the concentration camps and the Holocaust. The Holocaust is a word we didn't even use back in those days. And that went for a lot of other titles we have now. And that all is what led to my getting involved with the Nuremberg trials and everything else.
So when did you go to the Ardennes? What year did they send you overseas?
And this is almost toward the end of the war. It was in March. I remember we were in the high seas at Easter. And landed in Scotland.
This is 45?
Beginning of 45, right? But, from there, I was shipped into Paris, which was the military intelligence headquarters. And then after a few days in Paris, I was sent to Louvain, which is the northernmost town in France, kind of projection of Belgium in the Ardennes. That's where we went to hunting lodge. We did what was called detailed interrogation, DIC, 6824 DIC.
And
well, when that ended, it actually ended the day after I came from an assignment in Czechoslovakia with the 60th Armored Division, which had been sent to Czechoslovakia by then. And their training was finished. So I made it a point to, well, I should backtrack a little bit. I said that we interrogated only high-ranking generals and scientists. So part of my responsibility is to go to different PW camps where we had taken prisoners and to find out which ones we would interrogate for detailed interrogation. And if they were qualified, like general officer, we would bring them to our detailed interrogation center and interrogate them. And that's what I was doing. And I came in the day the war ended, the day before the war ended, because I drove right past the little schoolhouse in Reims when Yodel was signing the surrender document. I drove right by, didn't even know it. I could have stopped in and watched the show. So I learned that the war was over. And then I stayed on in about maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And my commanding officer called me in and said, we're going to close this operation. No longer needed it. But he said, you're going to a place I've never heard of before. It's called Mandorf, Luxembourg. He said Luxembourg, I shut up. I ended up in the Philippines. I told him I'm born in Luxembourg. Really young we were. So then I was transferred to Luxembourg, and we were opening a new installation there. And that's where, when we started interrogating the high-ranking Nazis.
So you went there in March of '45, and everyone knew the war was shortly over.
Well, yeah, we're pretty much.
And so,
we were
what information at that time were they telling you to get?
Well, they were in a situation that involved the war crimes trials.
Okay, so already in March they knew.
Well, actually, it was decided in March at Yalta, when Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin got together, and they decided that the high-ranking Nazis would be tried and punished for their crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes against the peace, and that they were going to have a military tribunal, just like President Bush has said, we're going to have a military tribunal for Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and those characters. Justice Jackson was appointed by President Truman to be the prosecutor for the war crimes trials. And remember, Jackson said, well, we don't know too much about these characters we're going to try. We want to find out more about them. You know, what kind of people are they? Are they sane, insane? What were their titles? What was their rank, their responsibility? And who did what? Who started the concentration camps? And what was the SS and the SA and all the others? So that is where this special detention center, how it came about. They picked Luxembourg because it's small. Nobody knew where we were. Big cover of secrecy, not like Guantanamo, which is in the news every day. But in Luxembourg, CNN hadn't been invented yet, so they didn't know where we were. And we took over a hotel, big hotel, 4 stories, which is big over there. And Mandorf is a spa, a little resort town. And this hotel had been used by the Germans for their rest, their R&R. And a lot of the high-ranking Nazis used to come in Mandorf and take the baths and drink the mineral water. That's how we knew about the facility. And then we used it as a billet for our soldiers when we liberated Luxembourg. And then the War Crimes Commission, which was headed by Justice Jackson, decided that'd be the ideal place to bring all the Nazi prisoners together. So we ended up there in May, the 10th of May, 1945. And every Nazi, high-ranking Nazi, generals, field marshals, guys like Keitel, Jodl, Dönitz, Raeder, Kesselring, von Rundstedt, von Blumberg, they're all rounded up. And then we had all the criminal element like Streicher, the Jew baiter, Lai, Labor Front, Hans Front, the Butcher of Poland. All of the guys were in the news all the time. Were they were called the Alte Kämpfer, the old fighters, who had helped Hitler come to power. And he rewarded them with the position that had the power of life and death. And then we had the ministers of the government, like von Papen, Admiral Horthy, the region of Hungary, Lord Mayor of Stirling of Stuttgart. all the big politicians. So we had 3 different categories.
And was this an Allied effort, or
Yeah, it was an allied effort.
did you have Soviet?
We had Soviet,
And
British, and Americans, and some French participation. So we brought them there, and then they put a barbed wire fence around the area, and the hotel became a prison. We had 391st Anti-Aircraft Battalion. They were the guards. And we had ordinary German PW who had been picked, carpenters, electricians, even a hotel manager, cooks and bakers. And they were rounded up, about 40 of them, to do the manual work. They were the housekeepers. And then we had 5 military intelligence personnel. I was one of the 5. And our job was to do the interrogating.
So what was it like? You'd heard of, you knew all the names already?
Oh yeah,
The reputation?
because we had studied whatever we did know about them. At Camp Ritchie, Maryland, we studied as much as we could. And we had studied films, the documentary films. Like whenever the Nazis had a party rally in Nuremberg, which was why we picked Nuremberg for the trials. That was kind of the headquarters of the Nazi party. And so we had captured films, which we studied personalities and all. But the questionnaires, the questions we asked them were submitted to us by the Nazi War Crimes Commission, Justice Track. It was like a pre-trial interrogation. When there's a crime committed, the prosecutor wants to interrogate the prisoners before they try them. They want to know about them. And that's really what we were doing. So those questionnaires were asked, and we get the answers, write our intelligence reports.
I think I read that you said they came in all shapes and sizes and
Oh yeah.
intelligence. And is there anyone who absolutely awed you and surprised you quite a bit?
Well, they all did. You know, we heard so much about the superior race and the Aryans. We expected to see blonde, blue-eyed Aryans, 7 feet tall. And they just looked like we did. I mean, some were skinny, some were fat, some were tall, some were short, some were intelligent, others were stupid. So you got a normal curve of everything. You got those who were fanatics, went to their death shouting out at them. And there were a lot more in the curve of, they said, we didn't know anything about this, we weren't told, we weren't informed. And then you had those who said, yeah, we were guilty, we deserved to be hanged. So you had a perfectly normal curve.
So you couldn't typify them as here is the elite of Nazi Germany, and they weren't thugs who were just happened to be swept up. They were from every walk of life.
Oh no, nobody was forced to be a Nazi, ever. I mean, if somebody says, and we went into a lot of that, well, they forced me, I was forced to be a Nazi. You were never forced to be a Nazi. You had to submit yourself to blood tests and genealogical tests to find out whether you had any Jewish blood in your veins or any other minority background. If you were not the super race, you know, the Übermensch, you couldn't belong to the Nazi party. So nobody was forced. You had to volunteer. And you had to really submit yourself to a lot of detailed inspection before you qualified. So if somebody was a member of the Nazi party, he was pretty much...
So no one person impressed you as being dignified and quite aware of what he did?
Oh yeah, as I said, they went from one extreme to the other. But you get the members of the German General Staff, which is the elite military unit, I mean, going back to the time of Frederick the Great, 1732. And these were the elite citizens in Germany, member of the German General Staff. They were more important than anybody. And a lot of those guys were professional soldiers, like Rommel, von Rundstedt. They were the guys with the big red stripe down the side of their trousers. And a lot of them were not tried. You know, they tried to assassinate Hitler.
Right.
So they were anti-Nazi. They were not members of the Nazi. Some of them were, like Keitel was a Nazi. But Jodl, who was the deputy chief of, he was a 4-star general in Generaloberst. Field Marshal was a 5-star general. And Keitel was a Nazi. He worshipped Hitler, and he had the blindfolds on. Jodl was his deputy, and my opinion, I think, I'm not sure that Jodl should have even been tried. He was just a soldier obeying orders, as was Rundstedt. But they did try to assassinate Hitler at one point, and a lot of them were executed, like Admiral Caneros. Dönitz, for instance, whom Hitler had picked to be a successor in lieu of Goering. Dönitz was a very dignified, he was a Grand Admiral, which was again the equivalent of a 5-star. And then you had the trash. Streicher, the Jew baiter, and Saukel, who was in charge of slave labor, Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland, who confessed to responsibility for the execution of more than 2.5 million Jews in Polish concentration camps. So you had that element, the street fighters, the brawlers, von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, and names that we hadn't even known about until we started to find out who did what. And then you had the guys who ran the government. I mean, those were all political opportunists, and they worked for the Kaiser. When the Weimar Republic came along, they became social democrats. And when Hitler came along, they joined the Nazi Party. If Stalin had been there, later they'd have all become communists. Opportunists.
I heard that Stalin wanted to kill everyone in the German army down to the rank of major. So.
Yeah, which is what he did with the Polish, the Katyn massacre.
Right.
Thousands of Polish officers were buried in mass graves, executed by Stalin. He tried to blame it on the Germans at first. He wasn't there. That was one of our problems in interrogating them. They would say to us, who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima? I mean, how many civilians did you kill when you dropped that bomb? Touch and go.
I read that Goering collected jokes.
Well, Goering, of course, was the most important, most, I shouldn't say popular, but the most notorious, the best known. And everybody wanted to meet Goering. And even among the other prisoners, when they were all in the same place, there were 86 of them. And, they weren't all important. A lot of them were arrested because they were in the wrong place. But Goering, of course, was the one that everybody wanted to look at. He was kind of like being in a zoo. But Goering was a very interesting personality. First of all, he had the 3rd highest IQ. The Chaffee, the finance minister, had the highest. And Arthur Seyss-Inquart of Austria, who betrayed Austria and organized the Anschluss, the merger. And then, of course, the 3rd highest was Goering. On the other extreme, the lowest of the 21 who were tried at the first session was Streicher, the Jew baiter. He was almost a moron, but he was a very active Jew baiter. He was an expert on the background of the Jews. But Goering was the one that was most interesting. If he was in a good mood, he was a real charmer. I mean, he could use his charisma. If he was in a good mood, he would tell you jokes and stories. And if he was in a bad mood and he wasn't interested, then you wanted to stay away from him.
I think I read that you said he collected jokes.
Oh yeah, he actually had when he was in a good mood, he had a little black joke book which he had in his pocket. And if he was in a good mood, he'd pull out the joke book and start the conversation with a couple of jokes. And he enjoyed them the most. I mean, he'd break into hysterical.
Any jokes you can tell us or remember?
Well, no, not really.
I understand.
There were jokes about Hitler and about Goebbels and Goering and even about Goering himself. He was able to laugh at himself. But on the other hand, he was an egomaniac. I mean, he was, the way he pranced around in all different kinds of uniforms and admired himself. But he also could laugh at himself. He'd tell jokes about himself. He was an actor. He liked to dress up. He loved a different uniform for almost every occasion, and so forth.
How about, what did you think of Rudolf Hess?
Well, now Hess was another, I should explain him. We didn't have Hess in Luxembourg. He was a prisoner of the British. He made that flight to England. And so he didn't join us until we were at Nuremberg. And when he came, of course, and that was the first time I met him in Nuremberg. And he claimed to have amnesia. He didn't remember anything, which was a pretty good defense. But we had a prison psychiatrist whose job was to give them the IQ test and determine whether they were sane or insane, and were they able to stand trial legally. Because the trial was to be a fair trial. It wasn't just a Russian trial. It was based on American principles of justice. But when Hess came, he said he had lost his memory. He couldn't remember anything. Even when we put him in the same room with Goering, and Goering would say, don't you remember me? I'm Hermann Goering. We did this. He said, no, I don't remember you at all. I've never seen you. Which, of course, was an act, So Hess was interesting from the psychological standpoint. He was also interesting because he was a hypochondriac. He had every illness or sickness. I think he had every doctor in Germany looking at him at some time or other. And when doctors didn't help his imaginary illnesses, he went to quacks. And he began astrology, and he began all kinds of herbal medicines and magic and mysticism. He was a flake. Then, in the middle of the trial, after he'd gone through this business of pretending to have lost his memory, in the middle of the trial, he finally stood up right in the courtroom and said, I've been faking it. I really haven't lost my memory. It was part of my strategy. And a guy who would pull that kind of stuff has to be interesting. But he still was, he was not a leader at all. He was a follower. And he looked upon Hitler as his father. He had become brainwashed by a professor. He was actually born in Egypt, Hess was. And he was 15 years old before he ever got to Germany. He was born of German parents in Egypt. His father was in merchandising and export-import business. So Hess was born in Egypt. When he was 15 years old, his parents sent him back to Germany for his education. And so he went to high school and college in Germany. And his favorite professor was Professor Haushofer, who was a very famous guy and a teacher back in those days. And Haushofer really had a tremendous influence on Hess and persuaded him to join the Nazi Party. Hess was married eventually, had one son, and he paid very little attention to his wife and son. Hitler was his whole life. But Hess never wanted to be in charge of anything. He just wanted to be in the coattails. So yet Hitler named him the adjutant, his adjutant. And he was to be his third man. If anything happened to Hitler, Goering would be in charge. If anything happened to Goering, Hess would be in charge. So when this set up, Goering complained to Hitler. And they said, look, the guy's an idiot, not a leader. But Hitler felt that Hess had been so loyal to him that he always rewarded people who were loyal. No matter what they did wrong, Hitler would never turn against you, unless you turn against Hitler. If you turned against Hitler, then he'd never forgive you. But if you did something else wrong and you were one of his followers, Hitler never, like Streicher, for instance, who was put in exile, but he would have been executed when the Nazi Party turned against him. And he had insulted many of his fellow Nazis, including Goering, when he claimed that Goering's child, he had one daughter, was artificially the result of an artificial birth. And because Goering was a eunuch, well, Goering kicked up quite a fuss. And so Streicher was kicked out of the party toward the end of the war and put in exile on his farm. He couldn't leave his farm. But that was only because Hitler intervened. Streicher was one of his loyal followers. So this was true in the case of Hess and Goering. I mean, Hitler said to Goering, don't worry about it. I mean, he's named as your successor, but when I die and you become the Führer, then you can always kick him out. But I can't kick him out.
So how about the controversy over Hess and his going to Scotland and ending up in Spandau? Many claim that he was secreted away and wasn't allowed to see anyone because he knew he had information about a secret deal with...
That was a lot of media talk.
No.
Actually, he wasn't that important.
No.
He died at the age of 93. Now, how much harm could the guy do at 93 years old? And they claimed for a while that the CIA killed him. And then they claimed that the Russians killed him. When he was at Spandau for 40 years, the Russians guarded him 1 month, and the French the second one, the British a third, the Americans a fourth. My wife and I went to Berlin on an official visit when I was ambassador to Luxembourg, and the commandant of the Berlin Brigade, the general invited us to visit in Berlin, and he set up a special train through the Soviet zone, a private train. It's quite an experience. I mean, it's an old train, the engine, dining car and sleeping car, and just my wife and I and our military aide as passengers. It was deluxe. And then we had a helicopter, and we got a tour of Berlin, and I actually saw Hess in the garden, and the Soviets were guarding him that month. And we were visiting in Berlin, so I didn't get to see him. But if the British or the French or Americans had been guarding him, I would have been able to go in and talk to him in the prison. But he did some gardening, and he continued to be a flake. I mean, he still had all kinds of aches and pains. But he wasn't that important. But they claimed that we assassinated him, and because of this, why assassinate a guy 93 years old? How many wars is he going to lead?
So your assessment of the Nuremberg trials was pretty fair and even-handed?
Oh, definitely so. I mean, of course, there are critics of everything. I mean, you can get the greatest conductor in the world to conduct the greatest orchestra, and somebody at some inky-dink newspaper will criticize him. Somebody who can't even play a Jew's harp will criticize the conductor. So it's true. I'm sure they made mistakes. I'm sure that some things were wrong, but the trial was, according to American press, they could defend themselves.
When you started your interrogation, did the Germans have any inkling as to what was to come?
Some did. Some suspected. Some were surprised. It really wasn't until the indictments were served. At first, they considered themselves prisoners of war. And then General Eisenhower ordered a general declassification. All the decorations and insignia of rank and uniforms were confiscated. And we addressed them only as Mr. Goering, Mr. Hess, Mr. So-and-so. And they wore army fatigues or second-class uniform, leftover uniforms. And if they didn't have their own clothes, some brought clothes, they were allowed to keep those. But they were declassified prisoners. By then, they became a little suspicious, And the biggest, nowadays we're talking about torture. You don't get information torturing a prisoner. You get in by winning his respect, confidence, and making him think that everybody has to have something on his chest and get rid of it, especially if he committed crimes. All you need to do is to be the right person to persuade him to talk, and you win his confidence. Give him a cigarette if he wants one. If he needs extra toothpaste, you arrange for him to have it. You don't sympathize with him. You don't agree with him. And we were trained, and that's part of what the psychological training of interrogation was, that you never let the prisoner think that you were on his side, that you felt that what he did was correct. So we were trained to have a poker face. You never showed an expression. You never nodded to agree or disagree. You never laughed at what he said when we were interrogating officially. And we had small talk, that's a different story. And you always preceded that. Interrogations were man to man. We'd sit in a comfortable chair and just chat. No notes, no recordings. A lot of that stuff hadn't been invented yet, you know, it's 65 years ago. But we didn't even take notes. If a prisoner revealed something that was really important, we'd have to call a break and have the guard take him away for 15 minutes and go to the bathroom or have a cigarette or something. And during that time, he'd write down what you don't want to forget. And that was the technique. But you made him feel, we played one prisoner off against the other in Ashcan, which is the detention center in Luxembourg. In Nuremberg, they were in solitary confinement. In Luxembourg, they weren't locked in. They could visit each other, they could talk with each other, and go for walks in the hotel gardens within the barbed wire enclosure. And they get into arguments, and they start blaming each other. Well, we capitalized on that. We play one off against the other. Sometimes we kind of stimulated arguments by saying, you know, Lie said about Streicher, we'd say to Streicher, hey, Lie said this about you. Is it true? Then he'd get mad at Lie and he'd tell us things about him. So that's the way we got information. And we, when they were taking their walks, we were in the dining room where they were eating. We'd listen to conversations and that prompted questions. So we were really spying on them. And that's as far as we went. But the conduct was legitimate. And some of them even thanked us when the whole thing came to a close for the correct treatment they received. And this is the same thing in Guantanamo. And all these media talk about torturing, and that's a lot of baloney. Now, comparing Guantanamo, the prisoners we had in Germany and in Luxembourg, they were family men. They wanted to go home to their wives and children, so they cooperated. The thing you hold over a prisoner's head is uncertainty. He doesn't know what's going to happen to him. And as long as he doesn't know what's going to happen to him, he's going to cooperate, because if he doesn't, something might happen. We might hang him. He didn't know. In Guantanamo, those guys that want to go home, wherever they go back to a cave, those Al-Qaeda people, they want to die. They want to go to heaven and sit at Allah's right hand and have those 72 vestal versions. So they bite. You've probably heard some stories, and they're true, and I can verify those. A guard walks past a prisoner's cell, they're kind of like in a cage. And a guy stands there with a paper cup of urine and throws it in the guard's face. My guess is, I know if it happened to me, if I got that guy on the side, you get a kick in the pants, and they're really a sturdy one. Those guys want to be martyrs, they want to die. So what the media claims is torture. That's really some guard taking off on a prisoner who abused him. They had feces and urine, and they bite, they kick, they complain about the beds. They're very comfortable. They have mattresses and springs, and they have a carpet, their prayer carpet, and they have signs pointing toward Mecca for their prayers, and we provide them with a Quran, and they eat better than the Marines who guard them. So when somebody says they're protected by the Constitution, that's a lot of baloney. I mean, they're not American citizens, they're terrorists. They're not even soldiers, no uniform, no government. They're terrorists, murderers, mercenaries.
How about legacy of the Nuremberg trials, do you think that the World Court has adopted?
Well, if they would do that, but you can't, there really is no legal basis for that, because they're not an army, they're not soldiers.
I'm thinking maybe Milosevic, when they, from Yugoslavia, Serbia, when they,
Yeah,
with
but you
those.
see, Milosevic is not being tried by the Americans.
Right, but
We would probably use a military tribunal like Milosevic and Saddam Hussein. They're being tried by their own international, but by their own national court. Now, Milosevic by this Hague court, which is a big joke to him.
do you think so?
It's just a lot of baloney. Look how long Milosevic is on trial.
Opinions of the current military, should there be a draft? Should they reinstitute the draft? You know?
I don't think they ever could. Now, that's what, what's his name, is working on, Rangel. But if Rangel had an opportunity, he'll probably introduce a bill reestablishing the draft. I don't think that'll have a pass. You know, on one hand, we say the war is very unpopular with the American people, and then we're going to institute a draft to support that war. No way. No way.
When you went into the Army, was there a great feeling that nobody really knew what they were doing? You talk about your experience with, they're sending you down driving a tank instead of...
Oh, well, that happens in every army.
Right.
I mean,
So was that the prevailing...
The Army's primary function is to fill the gaps.
Right.
And if they need truck drivers the day you're drafted, you become a truck driver. And eventually it trickles down. I've run into this. Lawyers, with friends of mine, were trained lawyers, licensed lawyers. They're drafted, or they volunteer even. So they're lawyers. So they end up in a cooks and bakers school because they needed cooks that particular day. Eventually, it gets sifted out, and the guy ends up in the Judge Advocate General's department. It may take a year or two, but meanwhile, he gets military training, which everybody gets. You go through it's after you finish your basic training that they finally decide, okay, what is this guy best at? And if he has flat feet and he can't walk 25 miles, they'll say, see, where can we put him? And they find out he's a lawyer. Well, he's a lawyer, he doesn't need to walk 25 miles. That's the Army.
So there was a great deal of faith in the military and the leadership?
Yeah, once you're in, you take your oath. And I still think it's true nowadays. And I think I'm a perfectly good example. I'm a naturalized American. And I got an education here, went to a good university. I'm enjoying it. Why would I, in the case of war, Pearl Harbor, why wouldn't I feel patriotic and serve my country? And I think this is true of a great majority of Americans. In Vietnam, things began to deteriorate as far as the general public was concerned, and the media. In World War I, World War II, let's take World War II, when Franklin D. Roosevelt persuaded Congress to declare war after Pearl Harbor. The Germans declared war on the United States, you recall. And we, of course, declared war in return. From that point on, all dissent and all opinions was kept right at the edge of the water. If Herbert Hoover, former president, had gone to Berlin and given a talk criticizing the American government and its conduct of World War II, do you think he made it back alive? But now here we are fighting a war on terror, and we have former presidents and vice president going to Europe, going to the Arab Middle East. A former president goes to Dubai and gives a $500,000 speech attacking his government. And the vice president goes to Saudi Arabia attacking his government. Back in World War II days, that wouldn't have been tolerated. But,
someone tells us that the two most remarkable things of the 20th century for this country were the Marshall Plan and the GI Bill.
Right.
And
Note that after the war, in World War II, when Germany surrendered, what did we institute? We instituted the Morgenthau Plan, the denazification of Germany, non-fraternization. I know, I was there at the time. I was in Germany for a whole year after the war. And what we objected to, where we'd see the German people whom we bombed, whom we defeated, unconditional surrender. Now was our opportunity to sow the seeds of democracy. And here we had we weren't allowed to talk to them. I was in military intelligence, had a special order, which I cared, because I was allowed to go into German homes, but if the MPs had stopped me, I would have been arrested if I hadn't had orders permitting me to enter German homes. So that all changed when we finally realized that the Morgenthau Plan wasn't in our best interest. And then we introduced the Marshall Plan, and we completely reversed it. The Germans became our allies, and we started shipping in food and helping them in every way we could.
do you see an immediate effect of that?
Immediately, even while I was still there. I mean, the contrast was dark and day.
And then
Of course, that's one lesson we learned.
were the German people surprised?
Yeah, by then, at first, they were hurt because we'd often another attack here. Not everybody in Germany was a Nazi, as I pointed out. Population of Germany was 80 million. And at the height of its success, the peak of its success, the Nazi Party had 7 million members out of 80 million. That means that many people didn't want to be Nazis. And the great majority didn't want to be Nazis. But what could they do about it? You had a fear psychosis. You criticized Hitler or the Nazi Party, and you ended up in a concentration camp. And don't forget, we had a Blockleiter, and we had a Gauleiter, and we had a Kreisleiter. And this is a state leader, like a commissar for the Russians. You had a commissar for the Nazis. And then you went down to the city, to the county, to the city, to the neighborhood, to the Blockleiter. Nobody knew who the Blockleiter in your block was. Could be your own son, could be your wife or husband. Your children were rewarded in school if they reported on their parents doing something wrong. So people were afraid. Their mistake was they let too much happen before they took action. They were too apathetic. When they finally did wake up, it was too late. Because the government controlled the schools, the government controlled the press, the government controlled everything. Which, of course, makes me anti-big government.
All right, I guess we're almost running out of time here. Anything you have in summation that you can tell us? Or,
Well, a lot of times I'm asked, what did I learn from my experiences? My particular part of it, after I got out of the armed force and got involved in international politics and so forth, of course, that led to a lot of things. I ended up being an American ambassador because I think partially because of my military service and my background in getting to know the rise of National Socialism. Secondly, it's made me an opponent of big government. To me, one of the most unreliable statements in the world is, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. That isn't. I've learned not to trust that aspect of it. I'm against big government. I believe in states' rights. The states should control the neighborhood should control their education, and the government ought to get out of it. And if I were president, which will never happen, of course, but if I were president, the first thing I would do is close the Department of Education. I mean, a bunch of politicians in Washington can't possibly control education in their community. So I'm against big government for one.
well, I can't thank you enough. I'm sure you could go on for quite a while.
I hope that gives you a
I'd
good
like to ask you more questions, but you've had quite a career.
Thank you.
And thank you for your service to the country.
Thank you.